Hello, everyone, and welcome to Meet a Scientist, hosted by New Mexico EPSCOR. I'm your host, Caitlin Everhart, over at Explora Science Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Today, we have Lawrence Straus, who is a professor of archaeology at the University of New Mexico, as well as the editor of the Journal of Anthropological Research. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So first off, let's just start with you telling us a little bit about what it is that you do.
Well, I'm a prehistoric archaeologist who works in Western Europe, digging up remains of human beings who lived during the last ice age and the beginning of the present sort of warm area in Earth's history. People who lived really between about 50,000 years ago, who were Neanderthals, and usually around 5,000 years ago or so are people just like us. So I study people who um, saw the transition from one subspecies of humans to the other. And I do this by digging sites, mainly caves, in Spain, which is where I started and where I sort of ended my digging career. But also I've worked in Portugal, in France, and in Belgium. And I've been doing this for some 50 years, although I started learning to do archaeology in the United States beginning at age about 14, working in New England, in the Middle West, and even in the American Southwest. I was first out here in Albuquerque, 1967, as a freshman in college. But the pull of European Stone Age prehistory was very great because I come in on my mother's side from a family that had amateur Paleolithic archaeologists in it, my grandfather and my great-grandfather, neither of whom I knew, but that was in my blood and in my experience as a young child, looking at my grandfather's collections in his office in Bordeaux in southern France.
Wow. So you had your interest in archaeology started pretty young then.
Yes, as a kid.
Very cool. So what was the path that you took to get to your career? How did you go from an interest in archaeology to being an archaeologist?
Well, I started doing it on my own, really, in my hometown, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, digging in an area that was saved from condemnation by urban renewal and became a sort of a historical village, a site, a town site called Strawberry Bank, where old houses were preserved. And I had the idea of digging to see what was underground. And then I went to a high school, Phillips Exeter Academy, that had an archaeology club whose advisor was Dr. Gene Finch, who is a great bird watcher and an amateur archaeologist, an extraordinary man, one of my English teachers. And I became president of the archaeology club, which is sort of weird, but I stuck with it. Then I, started getting experience digging with them and working also in excavations in France. And as I said earlier, when it came time to look for colleges, I decided on a college that happily accepted me, University of Chicago, which is very well known for its anthropology department. Archaeology and Stone Age archaeology are part of anthropology departments in the United States. And so I worked at field schools, learning the trade, as it were, in the Southwest, and then got positions as a crew chief or supervisor on excavations in Illinois, and got further experience with a very famous archaeologist, Francois Borde, in Southwest France. I had an advisor at the University of Chicago, Professor Leslie Freeman, and other very important figures in my career. Professor Clark Howell, one of the founders of sort of the American School of Paleoanthropology, and Professor Carl Butzer, who studied environments of the Ice Age, and others. And one thing led to another. I got my bachelor's degree at the University of Chicago in 1967 in anthropology, with my specialization being in Stone Age archaeology. And I got an MA a year later in Paleolithic archaeology, and I set out to do my research on a period known as the Solutrean, about 25,000 years old, in northern Spain for my doctoral dissertation, having had a field season with a older classmate of mine in Spain in 1972. 1975, I finished my dissertation, got a job at the University of New Mexico, and have risen through the ranks here from being a visiting assistant professor 45 years ago to becoming the Leslie Spear Distinguished Professor of Anthropology. And I retired with that title 4 years ago, but I'm still a working retiree and edit UNM's flagship international journal. So I've been digging much of my life, although unhappily I stopped digging about 7 years ago, much to my regret, because that's what I really like to do. It combines being out in the field, out in the elements, as it were, in caves, and working with my hands and working with my back aching and so forth in the rain and the snow. Even outside of caves, you get bad weather in the heat. I like combining that, the outdoor aspect, with the intellectual aspect of publishing articles, analyzing artifacts, working with colleagues in archaeology and in biological and geological sciences from people all over the world, and putting together articles and monographs and writing up the results of our excavations, which I've now been doing for a long time in many countries.
What's the best dig that you've ever been on, or your best dig story?
Well, my last excavation, and by far the biggest and most important, and still ongoing from the point of view of analysis and publications, is a site in northern Spain called El Mirón Cave, which is in the mountains above the Bay of Biscay, basically, not too far from the city of Bilbao. And this is a site that I first visited in the fall of 1973. I thought it was a great looking cave with great potential. Nobody else thought so, but many, many years later, I managed to persuade my Cuban Spanish friend, Manolo Gonzalez Morales, with whom I had worked before, and he and I got our dissertations about the same time, me in Chicago, he in northern Spain, but me working in northern Spain, that we should try digging it. And the results were fabulous. We have a sequence there that goes from the time of the last Neanderthals, around 48,000 years ago, through the Bronze Age, which is about 3,500 years ago. And in this site, we have a long sequence of levels that pertain to the last part of the last ice age, to a culture known as the Magdalenian, who were responsible for a lot of the great cave art of that region and other parts of Spain, as well as southern France and Portugal. And we've excavated large numbers of Magdalenian levels dating from around 20,000 years ago until around 13,000 years ago, roughly. And we had in one part of the site, behind a very big block of stone that had fallen from the roof, about the size of a smart car, basically. A couple of our students, we had students from all over the world participating, from UNM, a lot of students, and a lot of students from Spain and other countries. A couple of students thought that we should excavate behind that block. That was not in our original plans. So they, on their own initiative and our approval, they started excavating right below what had been a layer of goat excrement. Basically, that part of the cave was used as a stable until really soon before we moved into the cave. I had seen it with goats using it back when I saw it in '73. And no sooner had we removed all the goat excrement and modern debris that we started hitting levels that looked suspiciously intact, like they hadn't been disturbed, and with artifacts that looked very Magdalenian, but it was very complicated to dig them. So we sort of set that aside, having made that demonstration. And years later, when I thought the site, when we were kind of sort of winding down, I thought, well, we ought to go back to that area and just look just in case. And so a Spanish student and I, who now has his doctorate from the University of Cantabria, my colleagues in Spain, and I were digging behind the block on the edge of a looter's hole. A big pothole had been dug by people looking for treasures. And the generator failed, and so we didn't have any lights, but we were digging by flashlight, and he and I discovered a human mandible, a human jaw, and a few other human bones, like part of a tibia. And they were all covered with red ochre. The rest is history. We discovered the first skeleton belonging to a Magdalenian age person ever found in the Iberian Peninsula. And this is an individual whom we call the Red Lady of El Miron, who dates to around 18,800, say 19,000 years ago, covered in red ochre. Her body had been ritually buried, and at some point the burial was disturbed by a wolf. Some of the bones are gnawed. And then they reburied her bones. It had been sort of messed up a little bit by the animal. They re-ochred the bones. And at some point, they made an engraving, sort of a triangular shaped engraving, which we interpret as possibly a feminine symbol. And on the front of that block, facing the mouth of the cave, and they covered the back of the block with ochre, and it's exactly the same ochre that's used to stain the bones. And that ochre we now know from analyses, chemical analyses basically, of the ochre comes from a source that's been pinpointed at 25 kilometers away. They removed the cranium, the jaw was left there, and one upper tooth. They removed most of the long bones except the tibia that had been gnawed by the wolf and then re-ochred, and all kinds of small bones. There are about 100 bones. So they removed part of the bones, maybe for display somewhere else, which is sort of typical behavior in that time in the Magdalenian, of moving bones around and perhaps displaying them elsewhere. Subsequently, we've published a monograph on this burial, and the DNA has been done. The father of ancient DNA, a professor in Germany of Swedish and Estonian origin, he personally came to sample the DNA, and surprisingly enough, he got DNA out of a finger bone. And there was the long and the short of it is we know a lot about the mitochondrial and nuclear DNA of this individual, and she ends up proving a hypothesis that I and other archaeologists had long been talking about from an archaeological standpoint, namely that during the worst of the last ice age, 20 to 25,000 years ago, people abandoned Northern Europe. And I excavated many sites in Belgium, so I know a bit about Northern-ish Europe. They abandoned Northern Europe and they took refuge in the Iberian Peninsula. We know that because there's a site in Belgium, near sites that I dug, that have DNA very similar to the individual in El Miron cave. And then that DNA signature, that genetic signature, reappears in Northern Europe, in Northern France, at the same cave in Belgium, in sites in Germany, when people were able to recolonize the North after the Ice Age started getting less intense. And this has been the beginning of a real big story on the population of Europe. And people are still working with the DNA from this site. We have other studies underway of DNA by colleagues in Germany and colleagues at Harvard trying to work out this story. We know from the calculus of her teeth, because they didn't go to the dentist in those days, they had a lot of tartar on their teeth. We know what she ate, and we probably know something about the genetics of the further information on genetics from the calculus. We know a lot about, what she ate also from striations on the teeth, wear on the teeth, and from stable isotopes, chemical analyses that are done on isotopes of the bones. So this discovery, which was quite almost fortuitous, but based on a hunch on my part, has had all kinds of repercussions, both in terms of the cultural meaning, because this was obviously a very special lady. She was a woman about 35 years old, average height, built very robustly. We have no idea why she died. The dental calculus could find no evidence of any bacteria that would have caused her death. There's no evidence of injury, at least on the bones that were preserved, but we don't know. Maybe she received a blow to the head and the head is gone, right? So it's sort of a mystery, but we know a lot about her, and we know that she was very special because there's nothing like this known from Spain or Portugal. Although we do have other interesting burials from France and Germany from this period in the Magdalenian that suggest that only certain people got burials. And they weren't just men, they weren't just big hunters, they included women. And she may have been something like a cure or something, or a curandera, a wise woman. Maybe she was very good with her knowledge of medicinal herbs. Who knows? But for example, we found evidence that she was eating mushrooms. So you can take that where you may. We have evidence that she was buried with, either accidentally or not, with large quantities of pollen from flowers that might suggest that they, in addition to the special ochre that they put with her, that they were putting flowers, although we can't absolutely prove that. But there's a lot of strange things about this burial, especially the block that was decorated marking this spot. And I should add that at the end of the day, when we're getting real hot, tired, and hungry and so forth, the sun comes down into the mouth of the cave. It's a very big cave mouth. And at the back of the vestibule of this cave, 30 meters back from the mouth, the sun hits that block right at the end of the afternoon. So, and it shines basically on these engravings that are on the block. And behind the block is where she was put to rest, and then reburied basically after disturbance by a wolf, from judging from the gnaw marks on the one bone.
Are there any last thoughts that you want to give? Any last pieces of advice for people who might want to become an archaeologist?
Well, try to find some teachers who are interested in this, and maybe ask them to take you to the Maxwell Museum to see kinds of things that the museum has. It's an exhibit, very old exhibit at this point, that I did with a colleague called Ancestors, which shows you a little bit about what we do, those of us who study Neanderthals and then anatomically modern people who replaced them around 35, 40,000 years ago. There are lots of archaeological sites in New Mexico and many other museums that you can visit. The National Park Service has lots of, excellent displays and programs, as do the museums of New Mexico, the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, for example, or the Palace of the Governors. There's a great place to learn about archaeology. And there are places where you can volunteer to help out on digs. It's a matter of trying it out. It's not for everybody. A lot of people, but once you've got hooked in it, once you've got the bug, it is something that is very, very much an avocation or vocation for the whole life. There are a lot of people who do this as amateurs who are excellent. They don't earn their living from it. I'm privileged by being able to earn a living by doing what I love. And it's important that you find something you love to try to make for a worthwhile life.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.